The engines fall silent, no moon, no stars. Just the faint whine of destroyer turbines slicing through the darkness, and the knowledge that somewhere ahead, 35 steel warships are racing south at 30 knots. On the night of November 30th, 1942, Lieutenant Roland Westholm throttled back PT-109 to barely an idle, the 3 Packard engines now burbling quietly in the black waters off Tassafaronga. Around him, 4 other PT boats drifted in similar silence, wooden hulls motionless, crews scanning the void for any sign of movement. Ahead of them, invisible but certain, came the Tokyo Express. Westholm raised his hand. The engineman shut down all 3 Packards. In the sudden quiet, the sound became unmistakable, the high-pitched turbine whine of destroyer propulsion systems running at high speed, growing steadily louder with each passing second. The wait had begun. For 6 weeks, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had been trying to stop these runs. 6 weeks of drifting in darkness, breathing gasoline fumes, watching Japanese destroyers race past untouched. 6 weeks of returning to Tulagi with torpedoes still mounted in their tubes and nothing to show for the night's work except exhaustion and the corrosive knowledge that the enemy garrison was growing stronger with each successful supply run. The Tokyo Express was Japan's lifeline to Guadalcanal. Destroyers racing down the slot under cover of darkness, unloading supplies and reinforcements directly onto the beaches, then sprinting back north before Henderson Field's aircraft could catch them at dawn. The system was inefficient, but it worked. Supplies arrived. Troops arrived. And the battle for Guadalcanal ground on. Tonight's intelligence said 8 destroyers were inbound, possibly more. Coast watchers hidden in the jungle-covered hills had radioed the sighting hours earlier. High speed, column formation, expected arrival within the hour. Westholm's boat carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, wooden tubes mounted on a wooden deck, aboard a wooden hull built by a company that normally made yachts. Each torpedo weighed 2,600 pounds and cost more than most of his crew would earn in a decade. Against them, steel destroyers displacing 2,000 tons, armed with 5-inch guns that could obliterate a PT boat with a single direct hit, crewed by men trained extensively in night combat. The imbalance was not theoretical. It was lethally immediate. A lookout whispered from the foredeck. Visual contact, darker shapes moving against the black horizon to the northwest. Then another, then several more. The Japanese formation was larger than expected, running in tight column at what appeared to be close to 30 knots. Westholm made no movement, not yet. The geometry had to be perfect. 1 shot. That was all they would get before the destroyer's searchlights snapped on and 5-inch shells began falling. He checked his watch. 23:15 hours. The Mark 8 torpedoes had been preset for high speed, 36 knots, with a depth setting of 10 feet. The range continued to close. 3,000 yards, 2,500, 2,000. Around him, the other boats waited in perfect silence. No radio chatter, no engine noise, just the sound of the enemy growing closer, and the knowledge that in the next few minutes, everything would change. The sea was calm, the air was heavy, and the Tokyo Express was coming directly toward them. Before we continue, click that subscribe button like this video and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. To understand why wooden boats were hunting steel destroyers in the darkness off Guadalcanal, one must first understand what made this island worth dying for. 4 months earlier, on August 7th, 1942, the 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal in the first major American offensive operation of the Pacific War. Their objective was an airfield the Japanese had been constructing near Lunga Point, a coral strip carved from jungle and swamp that would become the most contested piece of real estate in the South Pacific. The Marines seized it within days and renamed it Henderson Field. Suddenly, both sides found themselves fighting for something neither could afford to lose. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal represented the southern anchor of their defensive perimeter. Lose the island, and Rabaul, their major base in the region, would be exposed. An American advance northward through the Solomons toward the Philippines would become inevitable. For the Americans, Henderson Field provided the only land-based air power within striking range of Rabaul. Whoever controlled that airfield would control the air over the Central Solomons. And whoever controlled the air would ultimately control the campaign. The problem was supply. Both sides needed food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Neither side could deliver them safely by daylight. American control of Henderson Field meant that any Japanese ships attempting to approach during daylight hours would face Marine dive bombers and fighters. Japanese air power from Rabaul, though degraded by distance and attrition, remained strong enough to threaten American convoys during the day. This tactical stalemate produced the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers, fast, heavily armed, and crewed by men supremely confident in their night-fighting abilities, would race down the slot after dark, arriving off Guadalcanal after midnight. They would offload supplies and troops directly onto beaches or barges, then sprint back northward to get beyond Henderson Field's range before dawn. The system was brutally inefficient. Destroyers made poor cargo vessels, carrying perhaps 30 to 50 tons of supplies when configured for transport, far less than proper freighters. Supply drums frequently broke apart in the surf, spilling rice and ammunition into the sea. Troops drowned climbing down cargo nets in darkness, or when overloaded barges capsized. But inefficient supply was better than no supply at all. The Japanese destroyers were fast enough to outrun most American surface vessels. Their crews possessed optical equipment and tactical doctrine that gave them consistent advantages in darkness, advantages demonstrated bloodily at Cape Esperance, Savo Island, and the first night of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. American attempts to intercept the Tokyo Express with cruisers and destroyers had produced catastrophic losses. The U.S. Navy was learning, painfully, that it was not yet prepared to fight the Imperial Japanese Navy at night on anything approaching equal terms. This is where the PT boats entered the equation, not as a preferred solution, but as an available one. Motor torpedo boat, Squadron 3, had arrived at Tulagi in October with 12 boats. They were Elco 80-footers, plywood over wooden frames, powered by Packard engines that could push them past 40 knots in calm water. Each boat carried 4 torpedoes and a crew of 11 men. Most officers had 8 weeks of training. Most enlisted men had never been to sea before joining the Navy. The doctrine governing PT boat operations remained largely theoretical. The Navy's pre-war studies envisioned these vessels attacking slow merchant ships in harbors or serving as high-speed scouts for larger fleet units. The reality at Guadalcanal matched none of these scenarios. The PT boats were attempting to intercept destroyers capable of 35 knots, crewed by experts in night combat, armed with guns that could obliterate a plywood hull with a single shell. The tactical problem was not abstract. It was immediate and lethal. Through October and most of November, PT boat attacks had produced minimal results. Torpedoes missed in the darkness. Boats were caught by searchlights and forced to retreat before they could fire. Communication failures meant boats arrived too early or too late, missing convoys entirely. The squadron's war diary recorded consistent patrol activity, but few confirmed hits. The crews understood their position in the naval hierarchy. They were not fleet units. They were barely considered proper warships. Their primary value was presence, the knowledge that American forces were contesting the Tokyo Express, even when conventional units could not safely operate in these confined waters after dark. But presence without results bred only frustration. November 30th would be different. Not because of new equipment or revised doctrine, but because of circumstance. Because the PT boats would finally be in the right place at the right time, and because Lieutenant Westholm would make the decision to fire when the moment came. The Tokyo Express was coming, and for once, someone would be waiting. The first patrol had been a disaster. October 15th, 1942. 3 PT boats positioned off Cape Esperance, engines idling, waiting for intelligence reports that turned out to be 12 hours premature. The Tokyo Express came and went, while the boats sat uselessly at their patrol stations, having burned through their fuel reserves with nothing to show for it except exhaustion and the creeping suspicion that this entire concept was fundamentally flawed. The second patrol was worse. October 22nd. 4 boats this time, better intelligence, perfect positioning. They spotted the destroyer column at 2,000 yards, textbook range, and fired 8 torpedoes into the darkness. Not a single hit. Post-mission analysis suggested the torpedoes had run too deep, passing harmlessly beneath the destroyer's hulls. Or perhaps the depth settings had been correct, and the firing solutions had simply been wrong. In darkness, with targets moving at 30 knots, range estimation became guesswork dressed up as mathematics. The third patrol taught them about searchlights. November 3rd, PT-44 closed to 800 yards before firing, closer than doctrine recommended, closer than was remotely safe. The moment her torpedoes hit the water, a Japanese destroyer's searchlight snapped on with blinding intensity. 5-inch shells began falling within seconds. PT-44 survived only because her commander had the presence of mind to generate smoke immediately and turn away at full throttle. She returned to Tulagi with her hull riddled with shrapnel from near misses and 2 crew members wounded. 0 torpedoes hit, 2 men bleeding, and the Tokyo Express had delivered its cargo unmolested. The pattern repeated with variations throughout October and into November. Patrols conducted, torpedoes fired when opportunities arose, results minimal to non-existent. The Mark 8 torpedo itself became a source of bitter frustration. The weapon ran on compressed air, leaving a visible wake of bubbles that alert lookouts could spot even in darkness. Its gyroscope required careful maintenance in the tropical humidity, and when the gyros failed, which they did with disturbing regularity, the torpedoes would veer off course, sometimes circling back toward the boat that had fired them. The depth settings proved unreliable. Torpedoes set for 10 feet would run at 8 or 12, either porpoising on the surface or diving beneath their targets. When they worked brilliantly. When they didn't, crews returned to Tulagi with $40,000 worth of ordnance wasted and nothing to report except another failure. The boats themselves were breaking down. The Packard engines, magnificent machines when properly maintained, required constant attention in the South Pacific's harsh environment. Heat and humidity accelerated corrosion. Salt spray degraded lubricants. After 6 weeks of continuous operations, Squadron 3's boats were spending as much time under repair as on patrol. Engine failures during missions became routine. PT boats limping back to base on 2 engines, sometimes 1, occasionally under tow from another boat. The wooden hulls absorbed water and began to rot. Plywood decks delaminated despite multiple coats of marine varnish. Running aground on uncharted reefs, an occupational hazard when operating in poorly mapped waters at night, caused damage that required days of repair work with whatever materials could be scrounged. There was no dry dock at Tulagi, no machine shop capable of major overhauls, no stockpile of replacement parts. Repairs were accomplished through improvisation and determination by crews who understood that mechanical failure at sea could be as fatal as enemy action. But the worst damage was psychological. 6 weeks of night patrols. 6 weeks of drifting in darkness, breathing gasoline fumes, listening for destroyers. 6 weeks of watching the Tokyo Express race past, untouched, while American torpedoes missed or malfunctioned or simply disappeared into the black water without explanation. 6 weeks of returning to base with nothing to show for the risks taken except the knowledge that the Japanese garrison was growing stronger with each successful supply run. The crews felt it in different ways. Some became fatalistic, convinced that PT boats were simply incapable of stopping destroyers and that each patrol was just another exercise in futility. Others grew reckless, closing to suicidally short ranges in desperation to guarantee hits, forcing their commanders to restrain them. A few quietly requested transfers to other duties, unable to face another night of failure. Westholm felt it too. The weight of repeated setbacks, the corrosive doubt about whether this entire concept was viable, the exhaustion that came from operating on too little sleep and too much adrenaline. Command meant absorbing the frustration of his crew while maintaining the appearance of confidence he did not always feel. By late November, the psychological toll was becoming unsustainable. The squadron needed a success, not for strategic reasons, not for the official reports that went up the chain of command, but for the simple human need to know that what they were doing mattered. November 30th would provide that answer. But as Westholm drifted in the darkness off Tassafaronga, listening to the turbine whine of approaching destroyers, he had no way of knowing whether this night would be different from all the others. He only knew he would fire when the range was right. And hope. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to WWW2 Archives Declassified. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. The turbine whine had become a scream. Westholm could see them now. Dark shapes moving against the slightly lighter sky to the northwest. 1 destroyer, 2, 4, 6, 8. The entire column, running in tight formation at what had to be 30 knots or more, heading almost directly toward his position. The geometry was perfect. Range, 2,000 yards, then 1,500, then 1,200. Fire! The torpedo tubes released compressed air with a sharp hiss. The first Mark 8 dropped into the water with a heavy splash, its motor igniting instantly. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo launched, then the third. The fourth hung up briefly before the torpedo men cleared the obstruction and kicked it free manually. 4 torpedoes, 4 white wakes racing toward the enemy column. All engines full! Hard starboard! The 3 Packards roared to life. PT-109 surged forward, turning hard away from the destroyers, accelerating toward 40 knots. Around them, the other boats were firing now, white splashes marking torpedo launches in the darkness. Within 90 seconds, 15 or 16 torpedoes were running hot toward the Japanese formation. Then the searchlights snapped on. Brilliant white beams swept across the water, searching for targets. Star shells burst overhead, bathing the scene in harsh magnesium light that turned darkness into unnatural twilight. Westholm could see the destroyers clearly now. Massive steel hulls throwing spray, gun turrets already tracking toward the PT boats. The first 5-inch salvo screamed overhead like tearing canvas. Geysers erupted where shells struck water, columns of white spray towering 50 feet high. PT-109 was making 38 knots now, slamming hard against the chop, every impact jarring equipment loose and throwing crew members against bulkheads. Behind him, Westholm heard the 50 caliber gunners firing at the searchlights, futile but necessary, something to do besides wait for the shell that would tear them apart. Then came the explosions. The first was a deep, resonant boom that rolled across the water like thunder. A column of flame erupted from the lead destroyer's midsection, climbing 200 feet into the air. Seconds later, another explosion, this one farther back in the column, then a third. The torpedoes were hitting. Westholm risked a glance over his shoulder. One destroyer was clearly broken. Her back snapped, bow and stern rising at steep angles as the sea rushed into her ruptured hull. Another was dead in the water, listing heavily, flames pouring from her superstructure. A third appeared damaged but still under power, trailing smoke and turning away from the ambush. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Destroyers that moments before had been running in disciplined column now scattered in all directions. Some turned toward the PT boats, trying to close and engage with guns. Others turned away, seeking to escape. Two destroyers collided while maneuvering at high speed, the screech of tortured metal carrying clearly across the water even above the gunfire. 5-inch shells continued to fall, but the extreme range and darkness made accurate fire nearly impossible. The PT boats were already pulling away, trailing smoke from their generators, steering evasively, putting distance between themselves and the chaos they had created. After 10 minutes, the Japanese ceased fire. The destroyers that remained combat effective turned their attention to rescuing survivors, lowering boats and throwing lines to men in the water. Westholm brought PT-109 around in a wide arc, maintaining safe distance but keeping the enemy in sight. He could see at least 2 destroyers motionless, clearly sinking. Several others appeared damaged. The Tokyo Express had been stopped. For tonight, at least, no supplies would reach Guadalcanal. No reinforcements would wade ashore. The lifeline had been cut, not permanently, but decisively enough that the Japanese would have to reconsider whether these fast runs were still worth the cost. Westholm keyed the radio. All boats, report status. One by one they checked in. Torpedoes expended. Minor damage, no casualties. They had survived. More than that, they had won. The return to Tulagi took nearly 2 hours. The boats proceeded at moderate speed, conserving fuel, minimizing the risk of mechanical breakdown now that the adrenaline had faded and exhaustion was setting in. Each commander transmitted brief status reports over the radio circuit. Torpedoes expended, ammunition consumed, damage assessment. PT-38 had taken a 5-inch shell through her aft section, a dud that passed completely through the plywood hull without detonating, leaving massive entry and exit holes but no casualties. As they tied up at the floating dock, Squadron Commander Alan Montgomery was waiting with intelligence officers already clutching notebooks and pencils. The debriefing began immediately. How many destroyers in the formation? 8, Westholm said. Maybe 10, another commander countered. The darkness made accurate counts nearly impossible. How many torpedoes fired? 16, someone said. 18, corrected another. What was the range at launch? 1,200 yards. No, closer to 1,000. Or maybe 1,500. Hard to judge in darkness with targets moving at high speed. How many hits observed? This was where the reports diverged most dramatically. Some crews claimed to have seen 6 destroyers struck. Others reported only 2 or 3 confirmed explosions. One boat commander insisted he'd witnessed a destroyer breaking in half. Another said he'd seen multiple ships collide in the chaos. The intelligence officers recorded everything without judgment, understanding that after-action reports compiled from observations made in darkness under combat conditions were always contradictory. What mattered were the patterns, the consistent details that emerged across multiple accounts. What was not in dispute? Multiple Japanese destroyers had been hit. The supply run had been disrupted. The Tokyo Express had been stopped, at least for tonight, and the cost had been minimal. Some expended ordnance, some fuel. One boat with holes that could be patched by morning. The debriefing lasted 90 minutes. Then came the waiting. Over the following 48 hours, confirmation filtered in from multiple sources. Coast watchers reported heavily damaged Japanese destroyers limping northward at reduced speed, one clearly down by the bow, another trailing oil and listing badly. Radio intercepts revealed increased Japanese communications traffic discussing casualties and damage, with tone and volume suggesting something more significant than routine operational losses. By December 2nd, the intelligence picture had clarified. The destroyer Takanami had sunk outright, going down with 197 of her crew. The destroyer Naganami had suffered severe bow damage and was under tow to Truk for repairs. Estimates suggested she'd be out of action for at least 3 weeks. The destroyer Makinami had sustained moderate damage from a near miss, flooding 2 compartments. Total Japanese casualties exceeded 300 men killed or wounded. For a single night's engagement involving wooden boats and inexperienced crews, the results were extraordinary. Commander Montgomery filed his action report on December the 2nd. His assessment was measured and professional, noting both successes and limitations. He emphasized that favorable tactical geometry, moonless darkness providing maximum concealment, and the Japanese formation's high speed reducing their ability to maneuver had all contributed to the outcome. He cautioned against assuming similar results under less favorable conditions. But he also recommended that PT boat patrols be increased in frequency and that additional boats be assigned to Guadalcanal as soon as possible. The recommendation would be approved within the week. For the crews, the confirmation brought something more valuable than official recognition. It brought validation, proof that what they were doing mattered, that the risks they took each night were not futile, that wooden boats with green crews could meaningfully challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest destroyers under the right circumstances. They had learned through failure. Now, finally, they had succeeded. The question was whether they could do it again. The night of November 30th changed the calculus. Japanese naval records captured after the war revealed the internal discussions that followed. The loss of Takanami with nearly 200 crew, the crippling damage to Naganami, casualties exceeding 300 men. These were unsustainable losses for what was supposed to be a routine supply mission. Senior officers at Rabaul had relied on speed and night fighting superiority to make the Tokyo Express runs acceptable risks. The realization that small wooden boats could inflict such damage forced a fundamental reassessment. The adaptations came quickly. Destroyer captains received new instructions. Approach Guadalcanal at reduced speeds when PT boats might be operating. Deploy additional lookouts, specifically to watch for torpedo wakes and small craft. Carry extra depth charges and light weapons for anti-PT defense, even though this reduced cargo capacity. The speed advantage that had made these runs relatively safe was being sacrificed for caution. Some runs began using fast cruisers instead of destroyers, heavier armor, more guns, better protection against torpedoes. But cruisers carried even less cargo than destroyers. Submarines were pressed into supply service, delivering critical medicines and ammunition submerged during daylight. Barges made runs in larger numbers, accepting losses to air attack on the calculation that enough might survive to keep the garrison fed. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. Each represented a compromise, a reduction in efficiency, a diversion of resources, and the PT boats kept coming. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 arrived at Tulagi in early December with 12 additional boats. Squadron 6 followed in January. By February 1943, more than 30 PT boats were operating in the Solomons, conducting nightly patrols that forced the Japanese to account for them in every operational plan. Not every engagement produced results like November 30th. On December the 3rd, PT boats attacked another destroyer formation and achieved no hits. The Japanese had deployed better lookouts and engaged immediately with searchlights and guns. 2 PT boats were damaged, but even failed attacks consumed Japanese time, ammunition, and attention. Time spent evading suspected PT positions was time not spent unloading supplies. Destroyers that once completed runs in 4 hours now took 6 or 7. On December 11th, PT boats damaged 2 more destroyers in a coordinated attack. Then again, on December 19th. The cumulative effect was becoming undeniable. Intelligence estimates compiled in January showed the Tokyo Express was delivering approximately 40% less cargo per run than in October. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal was slowly starving. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled. Disease claimed more casualties than combat. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition reducing entire units to ineffectiveness. The PT boats had not created this crisis alone. Marine and Army aircraft from Henderson Field remained the primary strangling force. Naval bombardments prevented safe resupply even at night. Ground forces pushed relentlessly across the island. But the PT boats had eliminated one of the few advantages the Japanese still possessed: the ability to run fast destroyers down the slot with acceptable losses. By early February, the decision was made. Guadalcanal would be evacuated. Tokyo used different terminology: strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. But the reality was simpler. The island could not be held. Over 3 nights in early February, destroyers raced to Guadalcanal, not with supplies but to evacuate survivors. Approximately 11,000 men were pulled off the island, leaving behind their dead, their equipment, and any pretense that the campaign had been anything other than a devastating defeat. The PT boats were present during those final runs, conducting their usual patrols. Most Japanese destroyers escaped, no longer burdened with cargo, focused solely on speed and survival, but several attacks forced destroyers to abandon planned pickup points, leaving hundreds of Japanese troops behind to face capture. The Tokyo Express had made its last run. The lifeline was cut, and wooden boats had helped cut it. The PT boats did not win Guadalcanal. The Marines won it, fighting through jungle and swamp, driving the Japanese backyard by bloody yard. The pilots from Henderson Field won it, flying daily missions that interdicted supply lines and contested the air. The sailors aboard cruisers and destroyers won it, fighting brutal night actions that left Iron Bottom Sound littered with wrecks. The supply ships won it, keeping American forces equipped and fed despite constant threat from air and submarine attack. But the PT boats played their part. They validated a concept that many senior officers had dismissed as experimental at best, wasteful at worst. They proved that small, inexpensive vessels operated by minimally trained crews could meaningfully affect naval operations when employed intelligently under favorable circumstances. They demonstrated that technological sophistication and overwhelming force were not the only paths to victory, that sometimes success came from being in the right place with the courage to fire torpedoes at an enemy that could obliterate you with a single salvo, and the skill to escape into darkness before that salvo arrived. The lesson echoed throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. PT boat production expanded. Over 500 boats built by war's end, squadrons deployed to every theater where their speed and torpedoes could be effectively utilized. They never became decisive weapons in the way carriers or submarines were decisive. They remained auxiliary vessels, useful in specific circumstances, unable to fundamentally alter strategic balance. Their greatest contribution was cumulative rather than spectacular. The steady pressure of nightly patrols, the constant threat that forced enemy commanders to divert resources and attention, the psychological corrosion of knowing that small boats might be waiting in any darkness, anywhere. The cost was real. Of the roughly 30 PT boats that operated around Guadalcanal between October 1942 and February 1943, 6 were lost to enemy action or operational accidents. 43 crew members were killed, dozens more were wounded. Many suffered from malaria, exhaustion, and the accumulated psychological stress of repeated combat missions in fragile boats where a single shell could prove fatal. Lieutenant Roland Westholm continued commanding PT-109 through January before being reassigned to staff duty in early February. He departed with a Navy Cross for the November 30th action and memories that would remain vivid decades later. The sound of destroyer turbines in darkness, the violent acceleration when engines roared to life, the deep boom of torpedoes striking home. His replacement arrived in late February, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, a newly commissioned officer assigned to take command of the same boat that had achieved Squadron 3's first major success. Kennedy would have his own engagement with Japanese destroyers in August 1943, when PT-109 was rammed and sunk in Blackett Strait. He and his crew would survive, barely, illustrating once again the fine line between success and catastrophe that PT boat crews navigated on every mission. The engagement at Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942, did not end the Guadalcanal campaign. It did not even guarantee subsequent successes. Many PT attacks in the following weeks produced minimal results or outright failures, but it proved what needed proving, that fragility could become a weapon, that small forces could break superior ones through persistence and well-placed strikes, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not through overwhelming power, but through cumulative pressure applied by men willing to drift in darkness and wait for their moment. The engines had fallen silent that night, and when they roared back to life, they changed the war. Not dramatically, not decisively, but enough. Sometimes, enough is all that matters. Don't just watch. Subscribe. Help WD Debut 2 Archives Declassified hit 1,000 subscribers.